at First and F Street Southeast when they were doing some digging, and they found that, and they decided that's a type of Allosaurus, which is a relative of the T-Rex, and they called it a Capitalosaurus. So there you see the picture of the Capitalosaurus, or at least the bone of the Capitalosaurus. And there's actually a state dinosaur for Maryland called Astrodon johnstoni. Mr. Johnston was a curator of archaeology and things in Maryland many years ago. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of different geologic time scales through this, and nobody's going to be responsible for all of these time periods that we're talking about, but I want to at least put this out in front of you so you have some idea of what it is that I'm talking about. As you go, the exhibit is called Deep Time because as you go deeper into the earth, you're going back into time. You know, it's deeper and deeper, and it goes by layers, and I'll show you in a few minutes what I'm talking about at the layers. But the earliest part of the earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, which is down in this area over here. And it's the first from 4 billion to 540 million years ago. It's called the Precambrian time. Why is it called Precambrian? Because the next time period is called Cambrian, and we'll talk about why that's an important section of time. And so this, starting with the Cambrian era, there was the Devonian, there's some of these others, but the ones I'm going to talk about is the Devonian, the Carboniferous, and the Permian. The Permian stopped at 252 million years ago, and there's a reason why that was a significant ending time, and where they had the changeover between what they called the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic. Something big happened right about there. After that became the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, and this is where we're going to find all the dinosaurs. Just to put it out there, Jurassic Park with the T-Rex and all that you saw there was not really Jurassic time period. That was really the Cretaceous time period. But that's, you know, a story for another day. The Cretaceous time period ended abruptly at 6.62 million years ago when the asteroid hit, and we'll talk about that more as we get there, and then becomes the modern era. So again, I was talking about the various going deeper into time. Anybody who's driven out toward Deep Lake, this is what's called Sideling Hill, which is on Route I-66 or 68. And you can see the various layers of Earth here. As each layer gets put down and things get put down over top of it, all the plant life and the animal life falls to the bottom over millions of years. Things get put on top of it, new things happen, and then geologic activity happens and things get changed in angles. So that's where I want to start on that. Now let me stop here and go into a different share because I want to get into the museum itself. Which is here, I guess. No, we're still looking at that. So let me put that down and go to here. Okay. Can everybody see what I'm looking at the?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is the entrance to the museum, to the Deep Time exhibit. But actually, I'm not going to start here because this is starting in modern times and going deeper into time as we go back. I want to go back to the beginning of time and start over here. So now we've gone back to the beginning of time, and then coming into our exhibit. This is a map of the museum. So we've come around from the back in here. So we're going to go in through that direction. And when you first come in here, you see our fossil lab. The fossil lab is where volunteers such as me or other people work on actual fossils that people have gotten. And you can see some of these fossils. What they do is they are taking some of the dirt and earth and plaster that they embed the fossils into out in the field, and they work on them here in the museum. People can come and watch when they're looking at things under the microscopes, and they explain what it is they're doing, whether it's something big like this or looking under the microscope at some of the plankton or other things. So let's talk about what actually is a fossil. And yes, a lot of us think that we're all fossils, some of us, at least some of us old people. I don't want to say how old I am, but I'm retiring soon, so so I get it. But you know, we talked about the Sideling Hill and the various layers. So when you find things in the layers, you want to date where it comes from and how old it is. So if you find something, you can tell. You might be able to tell from the layer it's in, and how do you find that out? There are two ways of dating things. You've all heard of carbon dating, but carbon dating doesn't really work for things that have been living more than 50,000 years ago. Carbon dating is only good for 0 to, or I guess 50 to 50,000 years. If you remember from any of your physics when you were in high school or college, carbon dating comes from the different portions of carbon 12, 13, and 14 that are incorporated into a living being. When it dies, no more is changing on. The carbon 14, which is unstable, slowly degrades back into carbon 13 and 12, and that goes at a certain half-life of decay, and so you can determine how old that particular living organism was. As I said, it doesn't really work for millions of years. So what they have to do is different type of dating of argon and potassium, which also has a very similar decay pattern, but it's on the order of millions and millions of years. There's a uranium type dating pattern. There's a number of things. So when you find something, you can get an idea from the layer that you're talking about, or that you found things in, how old it is. And also, if you find something that is deeper, that's probably older. If you find something that's more superficial, that's probably younger. But the problem is, as we saw from Sideling Hill, the Earth can move. So here's a fault line where this particular fossil is really above that one, but really is from a lower time period. So this is an older fossil than that. So you have to be careful of looking to see where you are and what else is in the area as you're dating these fossils. Other types of things that, so what becomes a fossil? Anything that's living, anything that can leave an impression, such as a leaf or footprints. Those are called track fossils. Sometimes, and we'll see later on, things that leaves put imprints into the ground that gets covered over, and things that are eating the leaves gives you an idea of what's going on. So let's go, where am I? Here, and talk about the beginnings of life, starting from 4.5 billion years ago. And then eventually, we don't know exactly how life began. Again, some of you might remember back from your early science days. We're all physicians, so we should know some of this. This isn't the Krebs cycle. I'm not going to quiz you on that. But life is determined by things with a membrane, a cell membrane, has genetic information, and has metabolism. And this is the important thing because we've all been talking about viruses lately. Viruses don't have metabolism, so they don't exactly get considered as life. You know, they're more symbiotic than anything else. So at some point, you got cells, living cells, single cell organisms. We don't know how that happened, and I'm not going to speculate about how that happened and where it came from. But then as they got to become more complex and single cell became multi-cell, and there are different types of organisms. There's the single cell things that are bacteria, and you know, the true cells, which eventually become, you know, multicellular organisms such as us. Now we get to the real time zones. So here we get into what's called the Ediacaran, which was the very first section of that earliest part of my slide. This is before 541 million years ago. So these things that you're looking at here really are animals, because during this period and earlier on, a lot of these single cell organisms, something called Cyanobacteria, started developing and emitting a very toxic chemical into the oceans and atmosphere. That was called oxygen. Earlier on, there was a very high level of carbon dioxide, but somewhere in the 600 to 1 billion years ago, more oxygen was being pumped into the atmosphere, and that killed off a lot of the earlier organisms, but allowed these other new multicellular organisms to flourish, and eventually became us. So these type of things are, as I said, are actually animals because they didn't have photosynthesis. They were taking in nutrients from the ocean water and taking them in from there. And you say they look like plants because they are anchored. Well, they're actually not, because they had some sort of a mechanism to move around and try to get into the ocean currents to get things away. And they show here some of these, as I said, the trace fossils of these things that fell to the ground, got covered over with sediment over the years, and we eventually found them years and years later. This is as best as I can get close to some of these things, but you can see some of these impressions of these things in the pre-Cambrian era. And then we get a lot of diversity. This is why the next section started as the pre-Cambrian, as the Cambrian era. They called it the Cambrian explosion. Just at this point in time, 541 million years ago, there was enough increase in diversity that things just took off. Lots of different life forms in all kinds of ways. There are sponges that were made. There were trilobites that came up, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There were these worm things here called Otoya, which is a small worm that that was in there, and again, it leaves these holes, these trace fossils. Here's one of the trilobites that was there. And the other thing that's cute to see is this thing right here. You can't really see it very well, but what that is was something called a conodont, which was actually some of the first vertebrates. That was a jawless fish, started having a notochord and segments, and took things in. Now I'm going to stop my share for a minute and go to, well, actually maybe I can do it. Let me go back to where I was, sorry. there, and I can show you that. So this is a Pacaya, which is one of the earliest conodont that had little segments and even had little eye pieces to it. And they've been able to see lots of different, had a mouth section to it. And we have things that are similar to these even now that have come down the years, such as the hagfish that look much like this. They're somewhat similar. So they had eyes, they had a spinal cord and a notochord, which is, just these are our earliest relatives. And in the exhibit, they have some of these actual fossils that are shown. Even a lot of these that are no longer around. I'll just get a better view of this one. This is called a Wywaxia. Has all sorts of funny arms and legs coming out of it. Let me come out of here, go to that, and then come back over to this way. So here's the Wywaxia. Here's some of the early trilobites here. Trilobites were a major life form for probably 300 million years. They started in this early Cambrian era and went up to about 250 million years later. So as we get out of the Cambrian, here's one of the trilobites again. And I have a picture of a trilobite looking like that. Trilobite is not called a trilobite because of a head, thorax, and tail, but because of the center section and the two side sections. And they've come up with multiple different species of trilobites that each have different eye structures, different internal structures, different number of sections. They have antennae with different eyes. They were really the major life form for a lot of years. In addition to that, the cephalopods were formed, and these things called crinoids. So I'm going to come up into here. And again, these are crinoids. Again, this looks like a plant, but actually it's an animal. They took in nutrients from the ocean, and and were animal-like. They took them in, and they didn't make their own food such as plants do. But there were plants, and there were corals, and so this is in the Ordovician era that went up until 419 million years ago. We're talking about a long time. Then we get into the Devonian, which is called the Age of Fishes. This is where the jawless fish that we talked about earlier developed some jaws and became much more prevalent. They had gills, they had gill arches, and the jaws, as we'll talk about in a little bit, eventually evolved further and went back into the skull to become some of the ear bones. The stapes was the first one, but the others were there too. So the other things that were being formed was, the things with shells, and the trilobites were still around at this point in time. So this is in the Devonian period up to 350 million years ago. At the same time, let's go around to the other side of the hall here. Sorry. things were happening on land. There were, some of the plants were coming out on land and sort of getting a little foothold. There were bacteria that were breaking things down and forming soil, and forming more nutrients into the land. Things were starting to crawl out onto the land. Some of these arthropods were crawling out onto the land, leaving little tracks, as you can see right here. And little by little, the plants got to be more numerous. They started developing roots. The arthropods became much more numerous as well. Things were, you know, working together. The whole thing that's just fascinating to me is how symbiotic everything is. Nothing really advances without other things coming along. The animals couldn't come out onto the land until the plants were there that they could eat. You know, they kept going back into the ocean for reproduction. We'll talk about that more in a few more minutes. And little by little, the fish started developing. Let me come to here and come around to that side here. The fish started developing early I don't know what I want to call it, early things that are the arms and legs. You know, they're called the tetrapods. Why did this happen? Things happened. There are a lot of different varieties, but this Tiktaalik is one of the earliest fish that started developing a shoulder girdle and arms and a pelvic girdle and legs. And, you know, some of you know me as an orthopedic surgeon. So, you know, I am fascinated by, you know, arms and legs, as you might expect. But even in this early fossils, they have a shoulder girdle. They have a single upper arm bone. They have two bones in the lower part, maybe some additional bones in the back of phalanges, same in a pelvic girdle, and in the femur and you know, fibula and tibia. But here we are talking, 450 million years ago, and these are some of the earliest patterns that are being put down that we're still carrying with us now. So we talked about the DNA earlier that was formed, and the patterns of the DNA that were being developed, and seeing what patterns worked and what was going to be able to be passed down and worked into the next generation and the next 100,000 generations. But we have this same DNA living with us now. The real first creature that really was coming out of the land, out of the ocean, was this Acanthostega, and it had real digits, had a pelvic girdle, digits here, had a femur, tibia, fibula, just like we do. So this is one of the early Acanthostegas from, you know, 400 million years ago, 350 million years ago. Had a flat body. The other thing that is interesting to me, as I've been reading about it, not only was it the bones that had to get evolved to be able to get into land. Obviously, the gills had to switch or had to develop some type of lungs to be able to take air in. Some of these early animals didn't really have real lungs, but would sort of gulp air and have oxygen transport that way. Some would come through the skin and have just a direct transport across the wet skin. Other things that had to develop was a GI system and a circulatory system, and being able to deal with waste. And they have found in the fossil record early evidence of some of the soft tissues that get, not really calcified, but fossilized, I guess, and come down to work with us and become, everything that we know. So, one of the things that had to be problems that had to be solved as they come out into land. Here's the Acanthostega that we were talking about with, the femur, tibia, fibula, humerus, radius, ulna. I just love this. But the the things that you had to figure out, and not only did the vertebrates have to do it, but the arthropods had to do it, and the plants had to do it, is figuring out how to maintain water, how to stay moist on the inside, how to get some sort of a protective thing on the outside. So the vertebrates developed a type of skin. The arthropods developed their external shell. The plants developed, cell walls and things on the outside. You had to figure out how to do the air. The lungs were developed. The arthropods have a type of air sacs or tubes that they have for air exchange. And in plants, as some of you may or may not remember from your botany, you get pores in the leaves where carbon dioxide gets brought in and the photosynthesis happens and lets out the carbon dioxide. Reproduction is important, obviously, and they had to figure out ways of keeping the eggs moist. The early vertebrates, as you know, went back into the water to reproduce. Then they developed what's called an amniotic cavity. And so there was a covering around it, so we were amniotes. And then they got shells, some that were soft, some that were hard. The arthropods also had to do their eggs and how to have protection for their eggs. The plants had to get seeds that it started with spores and became seeds, how to stand upright, and how to support yourself, both as the vertebrates and the arthropods with the legs, and plants getting their growing up to get height and be able to get their leaves up toward the sun. So that takes us to about 359 million years ago. Then we go to, let me go over to this portion of the world, something called the Carboniferous Period, which was from 359 million years ago to 300 million years ago. And so this part of the exhibit seems to show a coal mine. Why are we talking about coal mines? Because coal, as you may remember, came from trees. During this time period of the Carboniferous, there were lots and lots of trees that would fall over into the moats and into the water. Instead of completely decomposing, would get covered as the oceans and sandbars covered over them, and were buried, and pressure and heat made the tree trunks into coal. And this was repeated over and over again over number of millions of years to form the coal seams. And there's a little video that shows here when you're actually in the museum that demonstrates that. But the reason they do this to look like a coal mine, you can sort of see up in the ceiling, and they actually do find this in coal mines, you know, some of the only partially decomposed tree trunks. So, you know, that's the tree trunks on the side here, and on the floor you can see the leaves of the trees being pressed into the you know, the seam of the coal. If anybody is, you know, from Pennsylvania, has been in a coal mine, this is really what it does look like. And they have in the museum actual pieces of some of the tree coal that that comes out, and you can see that it's not trees like we've seen that we see now. They don't really have, you know, branches coming out. A lot of the leaves came directly off of the trunks, and you see the scars of the leaves on these trunks like that, like copsids are the what it is. And eventually the different types of trees that we now know, what's called angiosperms, developed a few million years later after that. Now, in this Carboniferous period, you see, I'm not really talking about much of the way in the vertebrates, because for whatever reason, there isn't much of a fossil record of vertebrates during this time period. So in the Carboniferous, and in that period, they don't really find very much of vertebrate fossils. There is some that they found in England and in other parts of the world, but it's really not as much as we find, say, in the you know, western part of the United States, in what's called the Burgess Shale, where all the Cambrian stuff is. It's just not quite as prolific. So we talk somewhat about ecology and ecosystems and how everything is, you know, works with each other. Here in one tree is an ecosystem of the insects eating the leaves, with the plants, some of the small little animals that were here that we're able to find were eating each other and eating the insects. When things die, the detrivores, whether it's the type of animals or arthropods that were eating, like they were eating the dead wood and dead insects and things, and this recycles all of the material, which for a moment I'll backtrack to the Carboniferous period, because all of that carbon that was put down in that period was sitting inside the earth for 300 million years, until 1880 or whenever it was that they started digging coal up and you know, burning it and releasing all that coal and carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And this is one of the other main points of this whole exhibit, is how changing climates and somewhat of what humans do to change the climates are changing the world in which we live. Okay, so let's go around to the next part. So this is in the Permian time period. The Permian time is from 300 to 252 million years ago. And you can see the vertebrates have gotten a little bigger. Now we are able to find much more in the way of fossils. And this guy called a Dimetrodon is actually one of my my favorite specimens, because he looks like he's a dinosaur, but he's really not. He's the dinosaurs and the vertebrate, let's put it this way, the vertebrate line split somewhere between the Carboniferous and Permian time period into two different groupings. One is called Synapsids, which relates to the number of holes in the skull behind the eye socket. So a synapsid has one hole behind the eye socket. A diapsid has two holes behind the eye socket. And that's split out somewhere in that area between the Carboniferous and Permian period. Now, the synapsids, which is what the Dimetrodon is, eventually became mammals and became us. So I like to tell people that this is their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the diapsids became the reptiles and dinosaurs and other animals. But again, I like to point out, here's a femur, here's a tibia, here's a fibula, here's a humerus, radius and ulna, there's an olecranon process. You know, this is, you know, this is our anatomy. You know, the anatomy, the basics of the anatomy was put down, you know, 350, 400 million years ago, and everything else is just variations on this theme. Here's the shoulder blade or scapula. Now, obviously, things are different. The guy's got, you know, cute teeth. You know, he's obviously a carnivore. What are these things up here? Nobody knows for sure. You know, it could have been for heat deposition, that it would have blood going up through there. It could have been just for show, you know, for maybe it could have been for fighting. Maybe people could have, you know, the Dimetrodons could have been fighting each other with it and using that to smack other Dimetrodons or other things that they were trying to eat. Maybe it had coloring on it and it was just for flirting. Nobody knows for sure, but we're trying to find more, as we get more specimens, we try to find out more information to know. This guy right here is, you know, most of the specimens that we see are exact duplicates of the real models, because the real models are kept, you know, in the labs for the scientists to study, to measure, to you know, compare and do all those things. But this guy, this is the real bones from 300 million years ago. So they have that out here. This was dug up in the early 1900s, really wasn't prepared and pulled out and cleaned off to get down to the bones until the 1980s. And so they have that, you know, shown here. And in this time, Permian time period, as I said, the Dimetrodon was obviously a carnivore with teeth like that, but the herbivores started becoming more prevalent as well. And they went up and down of who was eating who. First the herbivores were more prevalent, then the carnivores became more prevalent. It was the ebb and flow of time. And then what happened 252 million years ago? This was what's called the end of the Permian time period. So this is my next column of the you know, of my chart that I showed back at the beginning. In the Permian, at the end of the Permian time period, all of what's now Siberia became volcanoes. And this happened over a period of maybe 100,000 years, relatively short in geologic time periods, and spewed out all kinds of lava and ash and carbon dioxide and other chemicals that got into the air and then dissolved into the oceans, and 90 to 95% of life on Earth died. That's what they call a mass extinction. So many of these life forms, this is where the trilobites finally died out, and many other things died out, never to be seen again. Once something is extinct, all its genetic material is gone, and you never get that life back. So during this time period at 252 million years ago, so much died. They have, can I get to that? Let me come around over to here and get to the picture. I want to come over to this side. Oh, come on. I'm sorry. Well, maybe I can get to it there. I'm trying to show this. Okay, I can't show it very well. Maybe if I go to there and, here we go. I'm sorry. They have a video here of teeming life before the Permian extinction, and very little afterwards. And again, going through the layers of the Earth, you can find lots of life before it, and then suddenly lots disappears and things became very devoid of fossils until a few layers higher up. So you find right at a layer that lots of fossils below it, and then very few fossils above it. But the Permian extinction killed a lot of things, but it allowed some things to come through. Life will find a way. So some of the crocodile life forms, this one's called a Smilasuchus, developed with a few of these, and you can see some of these skulls here. These are early mammals, and here's even a jaw. This is the actual size of this jaw, and they have a small they have a blow up of it, so you can see. They can tell that this was a carnivore by the tooth structure. They study teeth and jaw structures a lot because it tells what they're eating and how they evolve from one species to the next by the number of bones in the jaw. Sometimes there are, we just have one bone in the mandible, but there used to be others. And as I said, some of these migrated up into the ear to become our middle ear bones. And after the Permian extinction, things in the ocean came back into a renaissance of things in the ocean. The fish came back with the bony fish, and corals came back. Some of these urchin-like creatures came back. Some of them came back into the ocean. They have a little demonstration of the various jaw mechanisms, things that were buried into the mud, and you can see the sucking mechanisms of these early new fish that were coming in. Now, one of the things I want to talk about also is, from the devoid of the end Permian extinction came some of these early dinosaurs, and they became lots of different dinosaurs. Again, everything were filling the void, and some became more extinct over the years. And then at one point, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, all the dinosaurs disappeared, but only one type of dinosaur continued, and we know them now as birds. So we'll talk about that as we go on to the rest of the dinosaurs. So in this early Jurassic and time period was the Stegosaurus, and that's a favorite of a lot of the kids with the little with the there's plates on the top, but also they have, and this one doesn't show it very well, they had these spikes on the side. Let's go down to, where's our Stegosaurus? You see the spikes of the Stegosaurus. They use that to hit people, sorry, I keep saying that, as a weapon to hit other animals, in their fighting. Some people have jokingly called these things a thagomizer. One of the early cartoons of, might have been, I forgot the cartoon, they had a guy named Thag who got hit by one of these things, so they called it a thagomizer. So, the Stegosaurus and the Cambrian, which is this huge 50-foot guy. He's pretty big. But again, humerus, radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula, scapula, it's, pelvis, it's all there. One of the other things as I talked about is the plant and how insects were eating plants, and they leave specific patterns in the leaves. So you see in the fossil leaf this type of pattern, or maybe if they're not eating it, they're leaving what's called galls on it, which are the the eggs of the insects, and those get fossilized, and and we can see them millions of years later. And this kind of stuff still happens now with insects and plants. So after I learned about all this stuff, I was on a trip to Peru earlier last year. And so I'm sitting there, and all I'm doing is looking at the leaves and explaining to people about the leaves rather than looking at the ruins at Machu Picchu. So along with the Cambrian, there's a guy like this called a Diplodocus or Diplodocus. Again, he's 50, 75 feet long. And this one's a herbivore. But you can see the humerus on this one. This is a humerus of a Brachiosaurus. This is probably one of the largest animals ever to live on Earth. So this is the humerus that might be, I don't know, 2.5 feet long. This is 5 feet long. So you can imagine how big this Brachiosaurus was to be able to have a humerus that big. You know how big your humerus is. You can look at it, but this is huge. So this is there for people to touch and to play with and to think about. The other thing that this shows us, let me go over to here and come around over to, where am I? Right here. the dinosaurs, you know, were laying eggs, and they have found eggs that were fossilized. So they were caring for their young. One of the specimens that they found, I'm not sure how well you can see this, get as close as I can. They have found this called Oviraptor that was fossilized overlaying its eggs. So this was the mommy that probably got hit by, you know, either a volcano that just went over top of it, or a dust storm that laid a lot of things down over top of it, but it was killed laying on its eggs. When they first discovered this, they thought it was a predator trying to eat the eggs, but further study made, you know, when they found actually inside the eggs that these were the same animal. So they realized that this was the mother caring for its eggs, just like the birds do now. Now, how do you know whether when you find a dinosaur, whether it's a male or a female? You really don't know. Because they don't have any soft tissue parts that that we can find. There is some difference in bones, and in that when the female is you know, pregnant, I guess, you know, and forming the eggs, there are changes in the internal structure of the long bones to form what's called medullary bone. So if you can find a specimen that has this medullary bone, you know that that was a female that died when it was in the egg-laying years, so to speak. If you don't find the medullary bone, you don't know whether it was a male or more of an adolescent female. So we're trying to find other ways of determining that, and we just haven't gotten to that yet. If anybody else finds a good way to figure out the males and the females, we'll be happy to find out from you. Let me talk about this for just one moment, because you know we're all talking about global warming and the leaving of the ice caps. This is the Earth over time from 500 million years ago to now. This line right here is where there are polar ice caps. So anything above it, there are no polar ice caps. Anything below it, here's where the polar ice caps are. And so this is a measurement of the temperature, the overall temperature of the planet. And they can find that out from drilling cores and determining from the microscopic animals that they find fossilized. They're able to determine whether, you know, they were in high or low temperature time zones or zones. So here's the last 50 million years, and there's been ice polar caps here through this most of this time. There's a little blip up above it, but you see in the last few years what's going on, you know, right there. So here we are today over the last, you know, few thousand years, and we're losing our ice caps. And this is the point of the, you know, of our exhibit, is that changing temperatures of the world, you know, are changing things, and extinctions happen, and life will survive. But you don't know what's going to, you know, whether it's going to be you or whether it's going to be the T-Rex or what, when the extinction happens. So it is getting warmer now, as I've said. This is just the last few thousand years, and it's been going up here. So we don't know if it's going to go all the way up here and we're going to lose all our ice, or whether we're going to be able to calm that down and head that off. So after that little section, let's go over to probably the thing that everybody wants to see is the T-Rex. This is in the Cretaceous time. Notice that the T-Rex in the Cretaceous time isn't shown at the same time as these guys and the Stegosaurus, which was in the back, because Stegosaurus had died out. All these had died out by the time the T-Rex actually happened. So the T-Rex was say 70 to 60 some million years ago. And these were 200 million years ago. Here's the mass extinction of Permian time, the end of Permian 250 million years ago. And so this was 250 to 200, and then there was 150, and then 145 to 66. The T-Rex started from smaller Tyrannosaurs and Allosaurs, and slowly increased in size and became obviously the biggest, baddest, meanest thing going. The Triceratops that he's eating was found, both of these were found in an area of Montana called Hell's Creek. This particular guy was found by somebody named Hatcher. So he's given the name of Hatcher because of that was one of the early paleontologists from the museum. So the T-Rex is 40 to 50 feet long, weighed 10 to 20 tons, and has sort of arms that really didn't do much, probably held some things for while the jaw muscles were eating. They've done calculations from the size of the jaw and the attachments of the jaw, and to get the amount of force that this could do to crack bones, and they have found it's one of the highest amounts of forces. They have found animals with T-Rex bones T-Rex teeth embedded in the bones, obviously got away and died with the T-Rex teeth in the bones. So sometimes they got their prey and sometimes they didn't. So here's the back of the T-Rex. You can see this guy was old enough to start getting some spinal disease. You can see all the individual bones and where the discs would be. And here's an area where the bones had fused with each other, and he's starting to get some arthritic changes between these two bones. Again, here I am, the orthopedist, enjoying this stuff. But it shows that the biology is the biology, and things get older, and we all get older. But the other dinosaurs that were going on, because dinosaurs were walking around and they started getting feathers, and nobody knows whether the T-Rex had feathers or not. There is a thought that that maybe they did, because the early dinosaurs that developed flight might have had some feathers, and then they found some that really do have feathers that get fossilized. You can see, again, you can see the remnants of feathers in these guys. And again, this is what became what we call birds now. Some of the things came back into the ocean with the fish and these predators. And as we talk about you know, big fish, little fish. So they found inside this guy the little fish, but when they found inside this fish, there was another one, which is a different specimen from either one of these two. So this is one fossil with three animals: the big guy, the littler guy, and the littlest guy. Okay, we are starting to get close, so I want to keep moving along. And then one fine day in about 66 million years ago, let's go back to, something happened. You can get a little laugh about that because the dinosaurs disappeared. Why did they disappear? They found that an asteroid hit. Now, how do they know that? Well, first of all, they found a crater in the area of what's now the Yucatan. But that's not the only reason that they are able to find that. As we talked about the layers earlier, they find lots of dinosaur fossils in a lower layer. And then there's this one layer all around the world of something called iridium. Iridium is a radioactive material that is not normally found in on the Earth, but is much higher in asteroids. And so below this iridium layer, there are lots and lots of dinosaur fossils. Above it, there's nothing. So they've put it together that whatever caused this iridium layer, and what else would cause an iridium layer other than a big asteroid hitting, putting out, you know, dirt and dust all over the Earth, laying it down and having new stuff coming on top of it. On top of that would be they find things related to the impact of what's called shocked quartz and molten rock. And this is mostly around the area of the Yucatan, but this goes all the way up into the northern part of the United States. So what happened when this huge 6-mile wide asteroid hit? It had tsunamis, and they found evidence of tsunami all the way up into Alaska. Fires happened all over. The acid rain happened from all the dust. And the other thing is there's a lot of sulfur that's right there. So it's sulfuric acid that came out. And again, this killed 90% of life. But things came back, like after Mount St. Helens. If anybody remembers Mount St. Helens, life will recover. So, you know, so this is the other great mass extinction of 66 million years ago. And then we take a big jump because that's when mammals start taking over. So they have lots of mammals, and the rainforests recover. Let me come to here. And the mammals start showing up much more frequently. Things were very warm. This fern was found in Alaska. It had to be warm enough to be in Alaska. And you know, more and more of the animals and mammals, and everything else opened up. And then came this other silly creature called humans. Where do I get to the humans? Here's the humans. Humans have caused a lot of destruction, as we've talked about. There is mastodons that are no longer around. There are giant ground sloths that are no longer around. There are saber-toothed tigers that are no longer around. A lot of these things are all because of human activity. You know, as humans went out around the world and we went out into different portions of the world, we have managed to kill lots and lots of, where's what I want to be? I'm sorry. I want to go up to this side and here. This is the amount of species that have been killed off over the last, million years or so since the advent of humans into various areas of Africa, Eurasia, Australia, North America, and South America. We have been, our footprint has been all over the world. Anyway, so that's the overview. Here's, the sweep of the exhibit from earliest times all the way through to from current times all the way to the earliest times. Here's our Cambrian and Diplodocus. I like to put people right here and get the selfies over top of that. So I'm going to stop right there because we have a few minutes until the next thing that people need to get to when we're done. As you all know, the med school class graduation and tribute is going to happen courtesy of the AMA starting at 7 o'clock. So we have a few minutes to maybe we can take questions and figure out where to go from there. Okay, so Pia, you want to go on and go from there? Are any questions going?
Hey, sure. Do we have any questions? We are taking questions in the chat, and I know for me, I just something you had mentioned before that I thought was really phenomenal. You said that humans, because of the time span between the Stegosaurus and the T-Rex, that was what, 150 million years?
Right.
We are actually closer to the T-Rex than they are to their ancient ancestral Stegosaurus.
True. T-Rex is only 66 million years ago. Stegosaurus is 230, 240 million years ago. So the time difference between T-Rex and the Stegosaurus is 150 million years, give or take. And the T-Rex to us is only 66 million years. So we're closer to the T-Rex than we are to the Stegosaurus. We've been, talking about time periods that are just hard to really fathom to our human feelings. What's 100 million years sounds like so much, but it's, we have a hard time fathoming that, but it's just, this is why I love all this stuff.
Absolutely. And we do have a question actually from Dr. Cashel. Why did the tetrapods evolve to have 2 bones in the distal segments of their extremities and 1 bone in the proximal segment?
Oh, that's a great idea. I don't know. That's what worked. is the best I can come up with. I don't think they've ever found, in some of the early lungfish, and in the fins, they have one bone proximally and two bones distally. So that was something that was working. And I don't know if they've found fossils of other animals before that had other, that had two bones proximally or not. But, that's what worked. And so that's what they, what has been able to be passed down.
Great. Are there any other questions people have?
Okay, well, if you can unmute yourselves, we can talk.
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of people left.
And we'd love to have any thoughts about anything that surprised you or
Montgomery County Medical Society.
Okay, well, so everybody needs to go see the AMA tribute so that all the medical students who haven't gotten a chance to graduate get a chance to do that. And Dr. Fauci is talking, and Dr. Patrice Harris is talking, and a lot of big lineups, plus people from Scrubs and other things. So I think we owe it to them to welcome them into the ranks of physicians.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, so go get something quick to eat, and then.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. I wanted to say that there's going to be a survey as well. Please respond to the survey, and thank you everyone for joining.
And thank you again to the DC Medical Society and to the Montgomery County Medical Society. This has been a lot of fun. Obviously you can tell I get enthusiastic about the bones and this, and the bone structures, but so much of this is just fascinating stuff to me. And